Police circulated images of his face for decades, but the murdered child had no public name. 65 years later, DNA identified him as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. In February 1957, LaSalle College student Frederick Benonis stopped near Susquehanna Road after chasing a rabbit. He noticed muskrat traps another student had left unset, decided to set them, and looked inside a cardboard box nearby. The box contained a young boy's body. Benonis did not report the discovery immediately because he feared police would confiscate the traps. A high school student who owned the traps had seen the body earlier, but also stayed silent. Those delays are documented parts of the discovery, not proof that either student harmed the child. When Benonis finally contacted police, investigators began with a dead child, no confirmed identity, and no missing child report that led directly to his family. The discovery did not begin with a family asking police to find a missing child. It began with two students who encountered the box separately and delayed reporting what they had seen. Detectives could document the child's injuries, clothing, blanket, and box, but they had no parent at the station, school record, or last known address attached to him. Police circulated his photograph widely, hoping someone would connect his face to a home and family. Thousands responded, yet no lead produced a confirmed name. In 2022, police said Joseph had never been reported missing. That fact explains why the usual starting point was absent, without establishing why no report existed or who left him there. One question hangs over this case. What happens when a child is found, the public is asked to help, and his name remains unknown for generations? Along the way, there are public photographs, thousands of leads, false trails that consumed years, and evidence that was preserved long enough to be tested. But an identity does not answer every question. It resolves one terrible uncertainty, then exposes another. Why did no missing person report lead police to this boy? And who placed him in that box? The original detectives looked for answers in the places available to them. The eventual answer came from somewhere they could not have anticipated. By the end, we will know the boy's name, and we will confront what the identification still could not settle. We will also examine why a case that reached so many people could remain without the one connection detectives needed. Before the case became a file, before the grave carried the name America's Unknown Child, there was a boy whose life investigators had to reconstruct from what remained after his death. The photograph police released was not intended to make him famous. It was an appeal for someone to recognize him. Detectives hoped a teacher, neighbor, relative, shopkeeper, or anyone who had noticed a missing child might see his face and come forward. That appeal carried a painful burden. To seek an identification, police had to share an image of a child who could no longer speak for himself. The response did not bring a parent to the station with proof. It did not produce the clear missing person match detectives needed. Instead, the case became a question for people far beyond Philadelphia. People could see the boy's face and still could not place him in a home, classroom, or family story. That silence around a child whose photograph was public became one of the case's strangest facts. It showed how little the public appeal had given police to connect him to a known life. At the time, investigators could not know how long that unanswered appeal would remain part of the case. When police asked the public for help, the mystery did not remain quiet. Leads arrived by the thousands. Phone calls, letters, and reports poured in, each one carrying a possible route to the boy's identity. Detectives had to sort through every claim and ask the same difficult question: did any of this connect to the child they had found? But volume is not the same as evidence. A caller might remember a child seen years earlier. Someone else might recognize a photograph, a piece of clothing, or a detail from the case. Every possible lead had to be checked against records, timelines, descriptions, and whatever physical evidence investigators had. That work was slow. Some reports ended quickly. Others looked promising at first, then pulled detectives into false trails that consumed time without producing the answer they needed. This was the first hard lesson of the investigation. The public had not ignored the boy. People responded in enormous numbers because the case disturbed them. A child had been found, and no one could say with certainty who he was. That uncertainty made people search their memories and question old stories they had heard. Yet attention alone could not tell detectives his name or where he had lived. The thousands of leads carried two meanings at once. They showed how badly people wanted an answer, and how little the original discovery had given investigators to work with. No clear missing child report met detectives at the start of the case. There was no immediate file that led to a family, a home, or a starting place. Thousands of paths opened, but none led cleanly to the boy's identity. That absence remained one of the case's most troubling facts. It raised a question police could not answer. How could no official missing child report point them toward the child they were trying to identify? Here is the part of the case that unsettled investigators most. The public response was enormous, but no missing person report led directly to the boy. That absence was not proof that nobody knew him. It showed that the investigation lacked the ordinary starting point it needed. A child usually exists inside other people's routines. A parent notices an empty bed. A teacher notices an unexplained absence. A relative, neighbor, or shopkeeper may notice that a familiar child has vanished. Detectives had to ask why none of those expected connections brought them a clear identification. This does not mean the public was indifferent. Thousands of people responded to the photographs and offered possible answers. Many of those tips came from people trying to help. But the people who could place the boy in a specific home, family, or daily life did not give police the information required to identify him. That is where the case takes a darker turn. The cardboard box contained physical evidence. The silence around the boy suggested an unseen history, although investigators could not tell whether it came from ignorance, fear, shame, or deliberate concealment. Over time, the unidentified boy became more than a police file. He was buried as America's unknown child, a name that carried public grief and an unbearable fact. Authorities had not identified him. People could recognize the label at once. They could remember the photograph, the questions, and the case. But the name was never a substitute for his own. The case remained rooted in Philadelphia and in the winter of 1957. Yet it lasted far beyond one investigation. Years passed. Detectives changed. Old files sat through moves, retirements, and new rounds of review. New forensic methods appeared, offering ways to examine evidence that detectives in 1957 could not have imagined. Still, the grave held the same unanswered question. That public memory mattered. The boy had not been forgotten when the first headlines faded and the original investigation lost momentum. His unidentified status remained important to investigators and to people who had followed the case for decades. There was something painful in that persistence. A child had become known across the country precisely because no one could tell the public who he was. America's unknown child sounded like a national act of mourning. It also carried a harder meaning. The evidence was incomplete. The leads had not delivered an answer, and the case remained open to a method that did not exist when the boy was found, one that could search for a name where every earlier path had failed. But the investigation changed shape when the surviving evidence met a method unavailable in 1957. Genetic genealogy gave detectives another way to seek an identity. Instead of waiting for a person to recognize the boy's face, investigators could use DNA to trace biological relationships through family lines. That advance did not make the work simple. Genetic genealogy is a process of comparison and elimination, not a single answer delivered by a machine. It can connect an unidentified person to relatives who may know nothing about the case. Each connection must be checked against the evidence and handled with care. There is also a difficult human question. The victim cannot consent to the search, and relatives who did not choose public attention can be drawn into an investigation by a biological link. Investigators must weigh privacy, the risk of exposing painful family history, and the duty to identify a child who cannot speak for himself. Doing nothing carries consequences as well. Evidence that might restore a name cannot answer anything if it remains unused. The old case file was no longer only a record of failure. It became a live inquiry involving both the dead and the living. Progress offered the possibility of an answer, but it also brought obligations that the detectives of 1957 could never have faced. Police pursued thousands of reports, compared missing children, circulated photographs, and tested theories that failed to supply a reliable identity. Some callers were sincere, but mistaken. Other claims explained one detail while contradicting another. Investigators had to separate a resemblance or family rumor from a connection they could verify. Genetic genealogy changed that search by connecting the child's DNA to biological relatives and giving detectives a family structure to examine. Birth records and other records could then test the emerging identity. The method did not arrive as one machine-generated answer. It narrowed relationships until independent facts supported the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The connection that finally mattered was not a witness suddenly recalling a face from 1957. It came from two things separated by decades: evidence preserved from the original investigation and genetic genealogy. One had to survive. The other had to be developed into a tool investigators could use. Together, they gave the case a route that the original detectives never had. Genetic genealogy does not produce a single flashing answer. It works through relationships, comparing biological information with family lines until investigators can begin to see where an unidentified person belongs. That process gave investigators a biological path to the boy's identity. But there is an important limit to hold on to. Identifying a victim through DNA does not, by itself, publicly establish who killed that victim. Those are separate questions, and they require different evidence. The breakthrough could restore the boy's name, while leaving the circumstances of his death unresolved. That distinction matters, because a name can feel like a complete answer when it is only one answer. The science was powerful, but it did not remove the need for corroboration, caution, or restraint. It gave investigators a person where there had long been an unknown child. It did not give the public a full verdict on every decision that led to his death. A genetic relationship alone could not safely attach a name to the child. Investigators still needed to build family branches, compare ages and locations, and test the result against records from the period. That corroboration protected against naming the wrong person from a coincidental or misunderstood match. The breakthrough came when biology and records converged on Joseph, answering the identity question at a standard the thousands of earlier tips had never reached. The original investigation looks different in light of genetic genealogy. In February 1957, Frederick Benonis found the child while checking muskrat traps. Police then circulated photographs, searched records, and followed thousands of leads in hopes that someone could recognize his face and tie it to a household. Those efforts showed sustained public interest, but did not produce a confirmed identity. The burial name, America's Unknown Child, preserved the absence rather than closing the case. Evidence and records remained available for investigators working with methods their predecessors could not have anticipated. Decades later, DNA relationships offered a path beyond visual recognition. That new path depended on earlier investigators preserving enough material for later science to examine. As investigators moved closer to an identification, the pressure changed. For 65 years, the boy could have belonged to any number of families touched by loss. Genetic genealogy began to narrow that vast field through biological relationships and family lines. Each new connection had to be tested. A possible branch was not enough. Investigators needed documentation and corroboration strong enough to attach a real name to a child who had spent decades known only as America's unknown child. The closer they came, the more careful the work had to become. A mistake would do more than create a bad record. It could give the wrong family a terrible answer and place Joseph's story in the wrong home. That caution can feel frustrating from the outside. They wanted the announcement, the family, and an explanation for why no missing person report had ever pointed police to him. But a name identified through genealogy could answer only one part of the case. The evidence from 1957 was still waiting. The cardboard box, the photographs released to the public, the thousands of leads that went nowhere, and the records of a child no one had successfully connected to a family. All of it now had to be measured against the emerging result. Investigators were approaching the answer to who he was. The question of who put him there remained separate, and it remained open. Care at the final stage mattered, because an error would create a second injustice. The wrong identification could place a murdered child in another family's history and expose living relatives to scrutiny without basis. Detectives therefore needed the family tree, records, and physical evidence to agree before announcing Joseph's name. After 65 years, investigators could finally say the name that had been absent from the original investigation, the public appeals, and the grave. The boy was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Those words did what no tip had managed to do. They moved him out of the category of America's unknown child and back into the category every child deserves first: a person with a name. The announcement did not make his death less terrible. It made the loss more specific. For decades, the case had been known through a cardboard box, police photographs, and a grave marked by an anonymous name. Joseph's identification changed the language of the case. He was no longer only a symbol of an unsolved mystery. He was a child with an identity that existed before police found him, before his photograph was circulated, and before the public came to know him as America's unknown child. Genetic genealogy did not change what happened in 1957. It gave investigators a way to recover a fact that had been missing for generations. The result brought relief, because the central question of who the child was had finally been answered. Joseph Augustus Zarelli had his name again. But the identification also made the remaining questions harder to ignore. Why had no missing person report led police to him? And who had placed him in the box? The December 2022 announcement restored more than a label. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was 4 years old, with a birth record and relatives who placed him inside a real family history. Detectives reported no missing child filing for Joseph. This absence helps explain why decades of missing child comparisons failed. Police were searching without an originating report that linked a household to the unidentified body. Genetic genealogy supplied the bridge, but his homicide remained active and no suspect was publicly charged. This is where the case becomes most disturbing, because Joseph's name does not soften the silence around his death. It sharpens it. The student checking muskrat traps mattered because Joseph was not found after a search that began at home. He was found by accident. The photographs mattered because the public saw his face, yet no confirmed identification reached police. The thousands of leads mattered because they showed the case was pursued, but effort alone could not reach the people with the information investigators needed. The missing person gap mattered because a child can disappear without creating the trail detectives expect. The grave name mattered because America's unknown child kept the unanswered question alive long enough for a future tool to address it. And the preserved evidence mattered because genetic genealogy finally pulled Joseph Augustus Zarelli out of anonymity. But the breakthrough also reveals the wall behind the wall. Identification is not the same as justice. A name can be restored while the person responsible remains publicly unnamed. After 65 years, the world could finally say who the child was, yet the act that put him in the box remained publicly unresolved. Science broke the silence around Joseph's identity. It did not establish every circumstance of his death. It did not make a witness come forward, and it did not turn an unanswered question into a public confession. It returned Joseph to history as a named child, while leaving investigators and the public with the question that has haunted this case from the beginning. Joseph's identification changed public understanding of the case without resolving his homicide. His name could finally appear at the grave and in police records, but genetic genealogy did not reveal every circumstance of his death. Police still had no missing child report from 1957 that led to him, and no one has been charged with killing him. Identifying a victim and proving a murder case required different evidence. Biological relationships and records answered the first question. The second still requires evidence connecting a person to the fatal acts. After 65 years, investigators restored Joseph's identity while continuing to confront a separate, unresolved crime. Joseph died at the age of 4. Investigative genetic genealogy restored his name in 2022, 65 years after his body was found. Philadelphia police said he had never been reported missing and that the homicide investigation remained active. They did not publicly identify an offender or announce evidence supporting a murder charge. The identification was a major answer, not a complete solution. Joseph's killing has produced no criminal charge against an offender. His name now belongs at the center of the case, ahead of the cardboard box and anonymous label that defined public memory for generations. Subscribe to Grim Inquiries for more documented cases where evidence matters more than rumor.